Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Oh, Tony, good to be back. Good to be turning the page to 2024. Boy, there's a lot to talk about already for what is supposed to be the offseason. Somehow it's super busy right now on so many fronts for Ohio State.
Yeah, and let's start off right now. We don't even enough banter, Tom. Frankly, I don't care. Okay? Let's talk about football. And on Thursday of last week, Ole Miss sophomore running back Quinshon Judkins enters the transfer portal, and you're like, oh, he got 1 year left in college football. He's going to go ahead and cash in somewhere. And strange that you'd be leaving Ole Miss, because Ole Miss usually brings in the transfers and allows those guys to cash in for 1 year. And so I just expected him to end up somewhere. I mean, he's from Alabama, so that would have been, you do the Jahmyr Gibbs type of thing. You just move on over there. I didn't expect Ohio State to be getting involved, but now he ends up tweeting from Columbus, Ohio on Sunday night, and there'd been rumblings that Ohio State and he were talking, and this is a real possibility. No player in the SEC has had more carries the last 2 years. No player in the country has had more carries in the last 2 years. Two-time All-SEC performer. How unexpected, Tom, were you caught off guard from this in terms of we see top guys enter the portal every year now, and it's always like, yeah, Ohio State should get involved. And then for like Ohio State to be seemingly involved here, was this unexpected for you?
It's a little bit of a surprise because when his first name first went in the portal, you kind of checked on it. It was like, I don't know that he and Trayon Henderson are going to be able to coexist at running back. You know, that you would have two kind of running back number one guys in that room at the same time. And Trayon Henderson has not announced yet what his plans are for 2024, but behind the scenes, you haven't really heard that he's strongly considering leaving. It seems like it. You know, last I heard from anyone, he was still sort of leaning towards coming back. So if they get Judkins too, and they keep Henderson, I think it might represent a little bit of a change of what are running backs looking for at the college level, because Trayon Henderson has not stayed consistently healthy. So for him, it would make sense to maybe split up the carries and lighten the load a little bit on him for 2024. For Judkins, I mean, as you said, the most carries in the nation the first 2 years. How often do we talk about running backs and, you know, their NFL draft decisions, and you go pro as early as you can because there's only so much tread left on those tires? Maybe, you know, you're rotating the tires a little bit next year, and maybe that takes a little less tread off of Judkins, off of Henderson, if they do, and this is not formal yet, it's not final yet, but it certainly seems like it's trending that direction at the moment. So maybe this is a little bit of a change of how running backs are approaching things. And if it is, boy, that seems like that's working out just in time for it to work out great for Ohio State.
Yeah, and if this did happen, this would be the third Ole Miss transfer for Ohio State in 2 years, joining Davison Igbinosun and Tywone Malone from last year. When you look at what Quinshon Judkins has done, 274 carries as a true freshman, over 20 carries a game, 271 last year in 13 games, over 20 carries a game, 2,725 career yards. Trayon Henderson, by the way, 2,745 career yards. Judkins with 31 rushing touchdowns. I think Henderson has 32 in his career. Henderson has 99 fewer career carries in his 3 years, however, than Judkins does in his 2 years. And this, to me, feels like a situation where, yeah, hey, wherever he ends up, I kind of need a break. You know, I'm perfectly fine splitting carries. We know Trayon Henderson and Evan Pryor came in together. They were perfectly fine with the idea of sharing carries. And so that wherever he ends up, whether Trayon Henderson is at Ohio State, whether it's Dallin Hayden, whoever, like the idea of sharing carries now is pretty common. my question, Tom, is when you look at Judkins as a freshman, 1,567 yards rushing, 5.7 yards per carry. Then as a sophomore, only 3 fewer carries, but he rushed for 400 fewer yards. His average fell from 5.7 yards per carry to 4.3 yards per carry. The offensive line, 80% of it was back. They brought in a transfer who beat out the last year's left tackle. So it's the same quarterback, Jackson Dart, both years. I'm wondering, and I have not had a good answer put forward in terms of why the quote-unquote down year, and 4.3 yards per carry for a workhorse for somebody as good as Judkins is a down year. And it's very similar to J.K. Dobbins in 2018 after the fantastic 1,403 yards as a freshman to then just barely over 1,000 yards. His average dropped from like 7.2 to like 4.1 or something like that in the span of a year. So I'm curious as to why the dip. If you have any insight on that, Tom, if you can tell me why, but also it takes away none of the boy, you should go get this guy factor here.
Yeah, I don't know that there's one good, clean answer to why the dip. I pulled up the game-by-game numbers for him, and he started the year real slowly. I mean, 2.7 yards per carry against Tulane, 2.8 against Georgia Tech, and neither of those teams were incredible. Only 4.6 yards per carry against Mercer. But when you get into sort of the heart of SEC play, LSU, 5.4 yards per carry, 33 carries, 177 yards. Arkansas, 3.6, so he kind of dipped down there. Auburn, 5.9 yards per carry. Vanderbilt, 7.3 yards per carry. Texas A&M, 4.4. And then last 4 games of the season, Georgia, 3.4. Louisiana Monroe, 3.6. Mississippi State, 4.3. Penn State, 3.1 in the bowl game. I think, Tony, to me, that looks a little like a guy who may have just sort of worn down a little bit over the course of the year. Because in October, the numbers are pretty darn good against SEC competition. 5.4 against Louisiana State last day of September, but close enough. And 5.9 against Auburn, 7.3 against Vanderbilt. And then it just kind of dips in November. And that's where you typically see guys getting bruised and battered. How many times have we talked to guys who will say, you're never 100% once the season starts? That looks like a guy who was never 100% once the season started. I have not gone back and pulled up Blake Corum's stats over like the 2021 or 2022 seasons by game. Maybe you can do that right now. But, you know, he is someone who, like this year, 2023, he didn't quite have that same load that he was carrying. 2021, 2022, he was just constantly in the high 20s, low 30s. And he obviously suffered that knee injury in the Illinois game in 2022 and then missed most of the Ohio State game as a result. It feels like that might be, you know, just guessing here, but you might see some of those same trends with Blake Corum. Have you had a chance to pull up the stats and prove me either right or wrong?
Well, just looking at, because Blake Corum didn't have an end of season last year in terms of late season, and he was not the guy in 2021. But this year, his last 100-yard game was November 11th against Penn State. His last 4 games, averaging over 20 carries per game, but it's at 94 yards rushing, 88, 52, 83. And it's like, in terms of yards per carry, the last 4 games, 3.4, 4.0, 3.3, 4.4. So the end of season type of thing, and with that kind of workload, and the simple fact of 34 carries in the bowl game against Penn State, I would transfer after that. Like, I'm in a bowl game. What are we doing here? Running me up the middle against Penn State's defense 34 times. This is supposed to be for the young kids, you know? And yes, I'm a sophomore. I'm still young, but come on. So I don't fault him, I guess, for that. But when you look at the last 2 seasons, last year he's one of the most explosive running backs in terms of 20, 30-yard rushes. This year, he had essentially the same number of 10-yard carries, 39 this year compared to 42 last year, but only 6 carries of 20 yards or more this year compared to 19 last year. Last year, 8 carries of 30 yards or more, and this year he had 3. Just 1 carry over 40 yards, nothing over 50. So he'd get to the, I guess, past the first level, but the second level wasn't happening. And if that's just wear and tear, better tackling. You know what? Instead of looking at the offensive line blocking, should probably look at the wide receiver and tight end blocking. That's probably maybe the answer there in terms of why didn't you have a better season. But it's just interesting to see that kind of drop. And of course, when you do, you're like, well, what is the reason for that? And generally not just one reason. But again, not something that anybody would have any concern about in terms of, well, you know, if these, as Tom, as you say, if these trends continue, so next year it's, 2.9 yards per carry. And it's like, what are you doing? I'm not expecting that. I also don't think this means,
Yeah, I'm not expecting that. And, I think the comparison that has gotten put out there a little bit in terms of a former Ohio State running back is you look at the career of J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins had the fantastic freshman year, sophomore year. He ended up splitting carries. That definitely is not the issue with Quinshon Judkins. He ended up splitting carries with Mike Weber his sophomore year and talked about how he was constantly trying to hit a home run his sophomore year. And then junior year sort of refocused and turned in one of the best running back seasons in Ohio State history, put up a 2,000-yard season. Fantastic. And, when he was healthy and on the field, boy, he was dynamite for the Buckeyes. So you could have a little bit of a bounce back from Judkins sort of in that sort of mold, but it may just be, like I said, getting run down just over the course of the season because the numbers, even if you go back to his freshman year, the numbers dipped to 4.1 and 4.0 in the bowl game after being 8.9, 5.4, 6.0 the 3 weeks before that. So, you may have some of that. You also you become a little bit more of a known quantity once things go. Once it's like, boy, this running back from Ole Miss, boy, he sure is running the ball a lot. You start seeing defenses gear up a little more to stop that. So maybe that's a little bit of a factor this year. And, as you said, the outside blocking, if you're getting through the first level just fine and you're not getting through the second level, there's a lot of other factors that can go into that. So there's a lot of possible explanations here. I'm not sure we have completely explained everything, but I also don't think this is something where you look at those stats and go, this guy's going to be terrible forever and never be any good. That I definitely don't think that's where this is. And he feels like he's a pretty good match stylistically for what Trayon Henderson does. They may be pretty good complementary backs.
Yeah, especially as much as Ohio State likes to run Henderson outside. Judkins is a fantastic inside runner and a guy that can bounce off tacklers, as we've seen. I didn't get to see too much of him this year, watched quite a bit of him as a true freshman because I think you saw him more places as a true freshman because he was standing out so often. I don't think this means, all of this interest means that Trayon Henderson is gone. I think we've been leaning to the fact that he's returning and kind of just waiting for that announcement. Then this comes in and it's like, well, does this mean he's gone? But again, Henderson came to Ohio State with the idea of sharing carries, and he's done that his entire career. He was one of those guys that bought in very early, bought in during recruiting, saying, yeah, the lighter the load, the less wear and tear that you have that you're taking with you to the NFL. The NFL teams like that. And I think obviously Quinshon Judkins knows that as well. You only have so many carries in you. And right now, Trayon Henderson has had a pretty light load over his career, has not even achieved what he did as a freshman yet in those last 2 years because of injuries. And going into next year, if they can, they needed to go to the portal to get somebody. Now, this is more than just somebody if they can land him. Because going into 2024 with just Trayon Henderson and Dallan Hayden, when Trayon Henderson has not been able to make it through a season since his freshman season, that's dangerous. And of course, you're bringing in 2 freshman running backs, but they want to have 5 scholarship guys. This would give them that 5, but also would raise the level of those 5 considerably. And the question I get a lot is like, well, what does this mean for Dallan Hayden? It's like, it means that this is big time college football. That's what this means.
Yeah. And he's someone, what's the classic line? You need a pair and a spare. And so having 3 running backs is, and not having to rely on a true freshman for that would be great. Does Dallan Hayden stick around if he's got, we're projecting multiple decisions ahead.
Yes.
We don't know. Dallan Hayden has sort of forever been the guy who had the big game against Maryland 2 years ago, and then everyone has sort of been waiting, and it just sort of hasn't happened yet. And, this is, you're past the transfer portal window, so now this becomes a very big spring for Dallin Hayden. Can Dallin Hayden show that he needs those carries? Because Tony Alford, one of my favorite interview moments of the last few years was Tony Alford being asked, how do I keep these guys happy? How do you keep all these guys happy if you've only got one football to hand around? And he kind of whipped his head around and said, I don't have to keep them happy. They have to keep me happy. And, I don't know how much that's, the dynamics there may have changed a little bit. That was probably 3 years ago at this point. And with the transfer portal and NIL and all that kind of stuff, some of that power dynamic may have changed a little bit, but, you've got to earn your way onto the field, and we don't get to watch practice. And it sort of feels like at some point, okay, there's something that is keeping him from playing. And the public explanation for quite a while has been pass blocking and blitz pickup and pass pro and all that kind of stuff. Whatever it is, this is a very big spring for him to show that, okay, I have corrected whatever the issues were and, can now get on the field. And whether that's just with Trayon Henderson ahead of him, or just with Quinshon Judkins ahead of him, or with Trayon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins ahead of him, whatever it is, you've got to be able to play up to that standard.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Going to the portal is supposed to raise the standard of the room that player is joining, and they did it with Davison Igbinosun. Jim Knowles has talked about that repeatedly, about how it raised everybody's play, and you saw that this year. Go and get Josh Simmons, raised a play there, and he won a job, ends up perhaps being the best offensive lineman in the class. One other aspect of this Judkins thing is I'm also seeing a lot of people saying on Twitter, on the message board, like, what good does it do if he's running behind the offensive line that we saw at Ohio State this year? And it's like, you're talking about the Cotton Bowl offensive line. You're not talking about the Ohio State offensive line that we saw in 2023, which was fine. You want better than fine, but the memory of that Cotton Bowl offensive line, that's not going to be the offensive line that you see next year for Ohio State. So I think worrying too much about that, thinking that's what you're going to see, is a waste of time, because that's not the offensive line that you're going to see. Maybe a different offensive line coach, maybe some different offensive linemen in there. It will be better than that Cotton Bowl offensive line, simply because that is the worst Ohio State offensive line I have seen since maybe the Florida State game back in 1999, 98, in the bowl game after the 97 season, where they just had no answer for the Florida State pass rush. But I do think the addition of Seth McLaughlin from Alabama adds to the bodies, adds to the options. But Tom, do you agree that too much is being made of the offensive line play in the Cotton Bowl regarding all of this?
Yeah, I think right now you have Ohio State fans reacting to losses in the last two games, and that's something that is never going to sit well with the fan base. It's certainly not going to sit well with the Ohio State fan base. And, that Cotton Bowl performance was such a historical anomaly. The offensive line was not dominant. This was not a Joe Moore award-winning offensive line this year by any means, but it improved over the course of the year, and it was pretty okay throughout the course of the year. And they ran the ball 33 times for 97 yards against Missouri. They were a little better than that against Michigan, 107 yards on 28 carries. So just shy of 4 yards a carry there against one of the best defenses in the country. And then before that, 215 yards against Minnesota, 177 against Michigan State, 139 against Rutgers, 181 against Wisconsin. They struggled against Penn State, but Penn State, again, one of the best defenses in the country. They were able to run the ball well enough against virtually everyone on their schedule this year that they were not playing a bunch of tremendous offenses. The defenses they played were by and large pretty okay. So I'm with you. I don't think that the Cotton Bowl is like a chilling portent of things to come for the Ohio State offensive line by any means. I think that more is a little bit of a one-off until you sort of see otherwise. It was a sort of mishmash, two guys in a different spot, a guy who really has been at Ohio State for 5 years now and had really not started except for here or there sort of emergency situations. it certainly, I think, was a little bit of maybe more of a wake-up call for Ohio State in terms of like, hey, you really need to address this with some additions because the depth isn't there. The starting five last year was fine. As of right now, Matt Jones is the only one who's leaving. Donovan Jackson still has to sort of make a decision. If Donovan Jackson is back and you're only replacing one offensive lineman, you have a second-year Luke Montgomery. You have Seth McLaughlin coming in from Alabama. I know everyone wants to talk about the snaps in the Rose Bowl. He started 25 games for Nick Saban. Nick Saban does not start bad players for 25 games. That is one of the pretty consistent themes of the Nick Saban era is pretty good players starting for him pretty much everywhere on the field. So it certainly would be an improvement over what Ohio State had if McLaughlin is the guy, or if Carson Hinsman is the guy, or and then you're giving yourself multiple options to improve things. You want to kick Josh Fryer inside from guard and start Luke Montgomery at right tackle? Fine. You want to put Tigre Shabola at right guard? Fine. Like you're just giving yourself more options. And if the baseline is sort of where the performance was in 2023, it feels like you're sort of, again, we've talked about this in the context of Will Howard, bringing in additional guys, you're kind of raising the floor. And there's nothing that says that they're done bringing in new guys in the transfer portal either. Maybe you're done for the month of February or the month of January. The portal opens again after spring ball, and they brought in Josh Simmons after spring ball last year. They are well aware that that's an option to improve their play overall. So yeah, I don't think the 2024 Ohio State run game is a lost cause, no matter what.
Yeah, and Carson Hinsman won the job competing against Victor Cutler and Jacob James. Whoever wins the center job this year will be competing against better talent than last year and will make that player better. One last thing, Tom, before we go, because this is very difficult for me. Jeremiah Smith, watched him in the All-American Bowl this weekend, had a touchdown on the first drive, then rarely got thrown to after that because the quarterback's not great in terms of being able to drop back and have time to throw. I have to put together my annual two deep, and I am confused as to what to do at receiver because I don't know that there's an answer yet. So I would like for you to give me the two deep in terms of the X, the Z, and the slot so that I can go ahead and use that information to try to cobble together an answer for myself. Go.
This feels a little bit unfair because we don't officially know what Emeka Egbuka is doing yet. Feels like that's going to be a pretty important part of the decision. I'm assuming he's coming back. Sort of trend has been towards he's likely coming back. So I'll say he's on there. How about if I just give you 6 names and then you can decide where they fit in terms of position? Because it feels like this is a great opportunity to be wrong about where one guy plays and that it has a cascade effect that impacts like where 4 other guys play. And it's like, how did you get none of the 6 right? Like, well, because of one guy. It's all his fault. Okay, so let's talk about the 6 guys. The 6 guys are Emeka Egbuka, assuming he's back, Carnell Tate, Brandon Inniss, Jeremiah Smith. I almost said Xavier Johnson just because I always get to this point of the list, and Xavier Johnson's always like the 4th or 5th guy that I say. Jaden Ballard, maybe. I'm kind of I kind of want to see it from Jaden Ballard because we sort of have projected Jaden Ballard to be in this conversation so many times and it hasn't happened yet. Mylan Graham, I would think maybe, except he's not coming in until the summer, so that probably pushes him down the list a little bit. Noah Rogers and Bryson Rogers both just transferred. Jeremiah McClellan's at Oregon. What's that? Yeah, Kojo Antwi, Keon Grays. I mean, Keon Grays missed basically the whole season with injury. So you really don't know what you got with those guys. It's crazy, but they're sort of thin at wide receiver, which is, you wouldn't think that the way Brian Hartline recruits, but the way Brian Hartline recruits, he's bringing in all these guys who come in with, high 4-star or 5-star talent and expectations. And then when you're not in line to start year 2, it's like, well, why am I still here? Boy, let's see. Starters, let's say, boy, you want to put Emeka Egbuka at X and Carnell Tate at Z and Brandon Innes at H, and then Jeremiah Smith is the fourth guy somewhere. Thoughts?
It is funny. You're talking about, we agree that they're thin, but they're kind of skinny fat, at the receiver position, because they're, I don't know, top heavy. And then we're talking about a top six. And I think we came up with like 7 total names, which is pretty concerning. But we'll see how things go. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that because I'm trying to put it together, and you could put Emeka Egbuka at any of the 3 spots because it's like, does he want to go be the Z like Garrett Wilson? Does he want to stay in the slot like Jackson Smith and Jigba? Does he want to be the X like Marvin Harrison? I don't know, but we'll find out. And when we ask Brian Hartline this winter, he'll probably say, no idea. We'll find out when we find out. So we'll all find out together, and the answer in the spring may be different than the answer in September, and that may be different than the answer in November. Everybody's going to play in the slot. Just figure out how often and when. So that will do it. I want to thank you all for tuning in. A reminder, find us at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Become a member. Lots of new members there. Jump on board right now. There's still going to be plenty happening. Obviously, that's the off season. That's when everything truly happens. So go ahead and hit thumbs up on this one. Hit the bell to be notified when we drop episodes, go live, instant reactions, emergency shows, all that sort of stuff. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys later.